Hi there, my name is Jennifer Peel. I'm an organic cannabis farmer outdoor. So our site is set up with two separate permits. One large site, 25 acres. But what we've done is we've segregated the administration and processing portion. So our outdoor cultivation field has a dividing line, an access point into harvesting. So what my question is, to save money and to be realistic, once we harvest our outdoor cannabis and bring it into the processing section, I want to be able to eliminate the recording of all the cameras facing the field because there's no more cannabis in it, and all cannabis has been moved into the production portion. So I want to know if that's going to pose a problem for me, because it'll save me about $100,000 in data storage for my cameras. So they'll be live, we'll still get to see the field, and the perimeter will still be active, but we're not going to record because there's no cannabis in that area. So I'm just wondering if that's going to be the question.
So I can answer that partially. I probably can't give you 100% the answer that you want. So we've had this question a little bit around whether or not, because there are some outdoor sites that they're actually kind of harvesting fresh and then they're moving off-site through sort of movement of storage to another site. So that's kind of the arrangement that they have as a business plan. And some of those sites have asked whether or not they can essentially kind of decommission their site during sort of winter months where, depending on where you are within Canada, you really could not grow cannabis.
From October till about the end of March.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the way that the regulations operate right now is technically there's not a way for us to, there's not really a way for someone to kind of notify us and just sort of turn that portion of it off. The requirements still apply. At the moment, the only way really to achieve it would be to submit an amendment that changes your perimeter for that period of time. We don't love that as a solution, so we've been trying to figure out a little bit, trying to understand just what the impacts of that are for people in terms of costs and and trying to figure out a way that we might be able to achieve it. So at the moment, I don't have a perfect answer for you, but I think, you know, just even the context you gave me in terms of data storage is really helpful for us. So it's something that we're working on, and we hope to kind of be able to get back out to people relatively soon to kind of say what might be options to be able to achieve it.
Okay, so we have until October. The intention is to deactivate the recording on those cameras because right now as a farmer, I cannot afford $100,000 in servers to store information that's going to be eagles and gophers. Like, I just can't. So we're going to attempt it, leave it as is, leave it active in the sense that if you say, no, you got to turn it on, well, then I'm going to have to bite the bullet and buy that server because I don't have the option of cloud-based storage right now because of where I'm located.
So I'm trying to better understand how the medical sales license is set up for the purposes of selling clones to medical patients. And I was just hoping you could shed a bit more light on how how the licenses talk to each other, how they stack, and who can sell what and how. So specifically, let's say that I'm a nursery and I want to sell clones to a medical patient. You mentioned earlier something about the way, a particular way it has to be packaged, a particular way it has to be labeled, and how it goes through the process of being sold and actually shipped to the medical patient. Can you from a high level, can you run through that in this instance?
Yeah, so when it comes to anyone who wants to sell to a medical patient directly, they have to have a medical sales license, right? That's number one. And a medical sales license holder can only sell finished packaged products. So it has to be packaged in the bottle and the labeling that you would find in any retailer anywhere in Canada. Mm-hmm. So that's number one. So if you are a nursery license holder and you want to get your plants and seeds into a medical patient's hands, it can happen a couple ways. One, it could be that you sell to a provincial retailer, because you can, as a nursery, sell your plants and seeds to a provincial retailer, and that person can go to a provincial retailer and actually buy that product from them. Another option is you can sell your plants and seeds to a medical sales license holder, so someone else, or you could have your own medical sales license. You would have to sell that to your medical sales license holder, and then they would sell it directly to a patient. Another option is a medical sales license holder could use you as a drop shipper.
Yeah.
to the patient. So you still have to have the medical sales license holder involved, but you're not necessarily having them take possession of that product. So it's a rather complex thing. The biggest thing is that any medical patient has to go through a medical sales license holder, period.
Right. In the instance of selling to the province, as a cultivator, so long as it's properly packaged, I theoretically could sell seeds to the province as a cultivator
Yes, you can.
without a processing license.
Correct. Yeah.
That's awesome.
So plants and seeds right off the get-go from cultivators as well as processors. Like I said earlier in that last couple of slides, like right away, everyone basically is allowed to sell plants and seeds
Cool.
to a province or territory or a medical sales license holder. But the biggest thing there is it has to be in the packaging and labeling that you would see at a retail store. It couldn't be bulk. And I want to highlight for plants and seeds, there are in the packaging section of the regulations of packaging and labeling, there are requirements on the maximum amount of plants and seeds you can put in one package that would be conceived as like one retail package.
Gotcha. And for the CRA consideration, how does that kind of square up here?
So the only consideration is that the package has to be appropriately stamped and it's duty-paid product because, like I mentioned, medicinal we don't have any distinction between medicinal and recreational cannabis, so it's
Right.
all taxed the same. So any sale to a medical patient must be done on a duty-paid stamp basis.
Okay, so if I'm selling to a medical patient, a plant in this case, as the medical sales, I would need to get an excise stamp license?
No, so the medical sales would be buying already packaged product from either a nursery or cultivator. So that packaged product coming to the medical sales holder would already be duty paid and stamped from the original cultivator or nursery.
Right, so it would be the cultivator that would need to apply for the license, the cultivator that would need to affix the stamp
Yes.
as per the.
How do you put a value on that clone? It could be 50 cents, it could be $50. What value do you tax
So
it at?
there's a flat rate on the clone, so.
It's between the sellers. And another part is, one of the most glorious parts of the new regulations is, you can be a generous Canadian. You can give somebody, if you've got some medical person, you give them 4 clones, do you have to pay an excise tax on the 4 clones you gave them?
No.
And what would the tax be on a clone? I don't think that category has actually been discussed.
Right, so it's the higher of a dollar per clone or 10% of the purchase price, whichever is higher. That's that would be the tax, that would be owing on that.
So if I sell a clone for 50 cents, you want $1 tax on it?
You're right, it would be, well, you'd have to sell it then for $1.50 because there'd be $1 worth of tax and then the 50 cents.
And if I sell it for 10 cents, it's $1.10?
You can sell for 10 cents, but you have to remit to us $1. So no one's gonna lose money on it, so you normally embed the tax into the sales price. That's how all businesses do it.
So if I sell a clone for $100, you want still $1 tax?
Well, in that case, it would be 10% of the purchase price, so it would
Okay.
be $10, would be the tax content of that sales price.
Thank you.
Thanks. A question for you on security. You mentioned obviously criminal record check. How about financial crimes? You said exorbitant financial crimes, which would end up as a criminal record. What issues under stock trading, EC securities kind of stuff?
So generally, when we work with the RCMP, we do a law enforcement record check, so that includes a variety of different things. So it will include a check of kind of all of their databases. They will double check the criminal record of the individual. They will go out to local law enforcement agencies. So if an individual resided in a number of different places, they will typically contact local law enforcement agencies to find out what information might be within their records that maybe wouldn't necessarily be in the centralized databases that RCMP has access to. And so that does include a variety of different elements, including financial crimes. So we will take that into consideration. Again, in terms of what impact that has for a security decision as to whether we would grant it, we really are looking for instances of kind of serious criminality. So we're really trying to understand, it goes back to what is that overall goal of the framework. The goal of the framework is to create something where we don't have product going into the hands of organized crime, and we're not bringing individuals into the business that have that background. And so those are the types of things that we're looking for. We're looking for individuals that by nature of being in the business are going to create a risk to public safety. So, but history, and that can include a variety of things. So whether, it is criminality in terms of, somebody's killed somebody, it could be an organized crime, it could be financial crimes. We haven't to date seen a lot of that yet, but it is something that we would take into consideration.
Great. And just one other question, obviously, with the Americans finally passing the free trade agreement. You guys didn't touch on the import exportation of this at all. Maybe you could spend a couple minutes talking about it. If I could get some answers in regards to CBD particularly, or hemp as well. CBD with no THC in it, is it, are we able to import that and export, etc.? And maybe with the licensing, just give me an overview, would be great. Thanks.
So I'll touch lightly on it. I'm not kind of an expert in the area. We can make sure that when we provide information and follow-up, I can make sure that you have some information on import and export and appropriate contact information. Generally, import restrictions are fairly limited in terms of what you can import. So you're looking generally at starting materials, research purposes, medical use. So it is fairly limited. There is, it looks like we may end up in a situation where U.S. has slightly different approach from us in terms of THC or CBD. From our purposes, we consider both of those cannabis products, and they are treated in the same way from a regulatory perspective.
Okay, add to that. Just for anyone who are interested in importing and exporting, to be able to do that, you first have to have a cannabis license, and then you must also apply for an import or export permit with our office. But the burden of proof on you guys is to just demonstrate how this import or export is tied to a medical or a research purpose. Just a heads up on that. It's not a free-for-all. Once you get a license, you can import wherever you want to. It's very much tied to medical purposes or research purposes for which we issue the import permit or export permit.
And then just the only thing I'll add to that is just for people's awareness. I mean, a lot of that is related to the fact not just how cannabis is regulated within Canada, but how it is regulated internationally. Because we are subject to international conventions around the movement of anything that's considered to be a narcotic or a controlled substance. And so with those international requirements, there are very strict requirements for individual governments in terms of the movement of substances across borders. And so we are still subject to those conventions. And that is not likely to change anytime soon. So I know people have views in terms of, the product is legal in Canada, why do we still have some of those tight restrictions around the movement of product across borders? That is because we are subject to those international conventions. And as I said, that's something that we have opportunity to influence as being a member at the table. But it is multi-jurisdictional, and they're not things that sort of change overnight. So with Canada being one of the few jurisdictions where the product has been legalized, we do sort of end up in a situation where the controls that we have in place, even for import and export, maybe are slightly different, even though it's a legalized product here for us. Okay.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I'm Richard. We're doing outdoor cultivation, standard license, and my question is regarding freezing. When I look at the cannabis licensing guide, it talks about for cultivation, you dried cannabis and bulk packaging of dried cannabis is allowed. Freezing isn't mentioned. We're looking at business-to-business sales, and we're wondering, is freezing covered under standard cultivation, or is freezing a process?
I actually can't say that I have an answer right now. I think I'd want to bring that question back to our team, because I don't know if it's something we've even had answered previously. So for consistency's sake, if it's okay, can I grab your email address if that's all right, and then try and get back to you with an answer once we've had a chance to explain it. So if I'm not, I don't want to guess what I think it is.
Yeah, and just so I understand, you're taking fresh product, freezing it immediately, and then you would be transferring it as a frozen product?
That's right.
Okay.
I'll give you my card
Okay,
afterwards.
that would be great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Liam with Elevated Signals. We provide inventory tracking and electronic record keeping for producers. Looking ahead to the future, once a producer has been licensed, what's the frequency of audits that we can expect from Health Canada and the CRA, and what do those audits look like for producers?
So for the CRA, anybody that's licensed with us can expect a visit from the CRA, minimum 4 times a year, maybe even more, just depending on the size of business, the scope of the operations. In terms of a full audit, anybody that pays us excise duty will receive an annual audit from us, where we will verify and ensure that what has remitted to us is accurate. So there is an annual audit. And it's like any other tax audit that a business may have. The auditor will come in, ask for certain books and records, transactions. If you have a certain software that you have licensees on, we have a section at the CRA, our electronic commerce section, that will probably be in touch with you as we do start these audits. And what they'll do is they'll ask for data records on how your records are formatted, and then when they go into the licensees' businesses, they can get those records extracted. They'll put them in a format that makes it easy for the auditors to do their work. Basically it's no different than any other type of audit, but certainly on an annual basis, anybody that owes us money will receive an audit from the CRA.
In regards to Health Canada, I used to be an inspector. I haven't been I am still technically, but I don't work in the group anymore for the last year. I can give you an overview. So I don't know if they've decided like a predetermined frequency in which they're doing inspections, but I can talk about the different types of inspections. So generally they have some announced inspections. In that case, they will advise you within a window of time of them showing up. They'll ask for specific documents in advance. It's more of a general overview audit in that case. They're just kind of getting a good understanding about what your company is trying to do for activities, how you're operating, understand a little bit about inventory, security. It's kind of like touching a little bit of everything. There are cases where we have compliance verification inspections. Those ones are due to generally a complaint, some information that we received along the way that there may be a concern at your site. Those are unannounced. So they will just show up at your site and say, hi, how are you doing today? I'm here to do an inspection. Generally, those are very targeted. They're there for a specific reason. The expectation for anyone at any given time for an inspection, especially for me, I use the regulations say you have to produce records within a reasonable period of time. If I'm here at your site for 3 or 4 days, I'd expect you to produce that record within those 3 or 4 days. If you are, I'm on site for a targeted inspection, depending on what the record is, if it's something that's quite robust, a lot of information, we can have a conversation about what your delivery time for that document would be to me in the, you send it to me by email within that week. Mm-hmm. If it's something relatively small, I would expect you to have it available on the spot. The expectation is that you have those records available at the time. So as an inspector, the rule that we use is if it's written down originally as a paper record, that is the original record. I would expect you to produce that for me. You can have scanned copies, but if I have a question regarding the original record, you would have to be able to produce the paper copy. If the original record was generated electronically, the expectation is that you're able to pull that information. Do I personally care that your server is located at your site? No, I don't. Mm-hmm. I just know that you have a computer system that you're going to be able to give me access to, that you're able to pull out the information that I'm looking for at that given time. We are always looking for 2 years worth of records at any particular point. It's part of the regulation, is 2 years. Depending on what's going on, we could go which way or other. I always call it the rabbit hole. It's like one of my most favorite things during my inspections. Where I think I'm going with my inspection takes me something completely different, just because, as you start getting into those details, you just start finding more information. So that's helpful.
Very helpful, yeah. Thank you so much. That's great. Thank you.
Actually, it's just in the licensing process. You'll remember when Jackie was going through the slides, that sort of graduated approach that we have for licensing. So your initial licensing really allows you to possess cannabis and to conduct activities with cannabis. You have to come in for an amendment to be able to sell a new class of cannabis beyond just plants and seeds. When you come in with that amendment, that is, at the moment, we will typically do an inspection prior to granting that sales authority. So that is our check-in before product is actually going out into retail sales or to medical patients. we want to make sure that the facility has been inspected at least once, so that is one that would be a planned inspection with you as part of that cycle.
And it would be announced. We
Oh,
would ask for
announced,
very
okay.
specific documents in advance of that.
I just have a pretty simple question actually, but we're building a micro facility on an 80-acre farm, and we've got a residence on there and a commercial chicken operation. What exactly do I need to do for the address for the facility? Do I need to differentiate, get a completely different number, or?
No, so you don't. The onus is on you to demonstrate that, so I talked about earlier about identifying your site number. So for example, I'm assuming that site that you're talking about, the microsite, is probably a separate building, right?
Yeah.
Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah.
Which it should be, to be clear, because it should be specific to the activities you're going to be doing for that license. If it's a separate building, you can identify that building, even though there's other things on site, that it is your perimeter of your site is the envelope of that building. One thing I would encourage you to consider is identifying in advance that you do have a home or a residence on the property, as well as this chicken farm, but we would expect you to identify and confirm that you're not intending to conduct any activities with cannabis at those sites. Another thing to consider is you may want to identify, say for example, if your company chooses to accept returns, how would you prevent cannabis being returned to your site, not ending up at the chicken farm or the house that's at the site?
Okay. Just another question from a Facebook group that I'm part of. They wanted me to ask this. Is Health Canada and CRA, are they going to consider sharing data instead of having to file 2 separate reports?
Short answer is not at this time. In the early days, we did look to see if we could sort of combine our into one filing. However, there was issues with privacy concerns. The information is used for different purposes, different acts, so there was a legal issue that would have prevented us from doing that. What I can say is though that Health Canada and CRA share information on a regular basis. So all the licensing decisions are shared with CRA. We do share compliance data back and forth. So both departments are fairly aware of situations that are happening with one department. The other department is aware of it. So if something isn't right, the CRA finds something that isn't right, they will inform Health Canada. Similarly, if Health Canada says, oh, there's problems with the inventory, they'll contact us and we'll investigate as well. So we do work closely together, but to answer your specific question, not at this time. You will still continue to have to file separately.
I have one clarification. It's not specific to your question, but it might be helpful for people who are looking to get into food. So if you are, you can have an address, so a location where you are producing products with cannabis at the same time as you are producing other food products, but the regulations do not allow those activities to be conducted within the same building. So if you're Mr. Christie and you're making cookies, you can't have a building that has kind of a I see Mr. Christie's at the back there. You can't have one building where you're producing a food product under the Food and Drug Act requirements and producing a cannabis food product within the same building. They have to be, you could have them at the same address. So you could have one building that is dedicated to cannabis edibles or other cannabis products, and you could have another building that is dedicated to production of other food products, but they cannot be co-located.
I started an application for a nursery on my property because we have an acre and we had a 1,200 square foot shop, and I was going to do like a 600 square foot nursery type of thing. And then so we did this, we had the survey, we did the latitude, longitude, all of that stuff, the overhead site thing. And we also did we started the security applications. Then we found out from our municipality ain't happening. So I basically canceled. I had to took all that information out. So right now, our security applications are sitting in limbo. Do they get processed in any way or is it's just sitting there?
They do not get processed. So I'll answer that kind of in terms of how it operates right now. So at the moment, you are only eligible to have security clearances processed if, one, you're linked to an application, or you're linked to a license holder, and you have to be one of the individuals within the positions that will require you to hold a security clearance. So those are basically the conditions. At the moment, we have a large number of applications in the system that are not linked. Those applications are not processed, and so we go back to the applicant and we'll communicate to them, you're not linked to an application, we're not processing you. We did have, when we went out in May and we were talking to people, we did have a number of questions that came to us out of interest from the micro community of would Health Canada consider receiving security clearance applications prior to receiving a license application. And what people were concerned about was there were people who had previous history with cannabis, and they were concerned that they would invest all the money into their application and then they would not make it through the security clearance process. So even though, as I say, that rate of refusal is fairly low, we do recognize that some people may kind of self-select themselves out of it. So they may just say, oh, I'm never going to get through, so I'm not even going to bother applying. So we are internally talking right now as to how it is that we could enable that. So if there is somebody that really wants to enter the legal market, but they're really nervous about kind of getting down that path so far, making all the investment and then not ever getting a security clearance, we're looking at options to be able to receive some security clearances prior to receiving a license application.
In our situation, is because of who we are. We have no criminal record at all. However, because who we are in social media, that's why we did it anyway, and we thought, okay, let's see, because we've done nothing, you know, certainly that I would think of, but at the same time, could there be a bias because of that?
So those are typically not the types of things that we would, I mean, it's hard for me to say definitively because it's speaking a little bit in the abstract, but in general, what you're talking about is, from what I'm understanding, is not typically something that we would be concerned about during the security process. As I say, we're really looking for instances of serious criminality and history of that. So we would be looking at, you know, previous history of trafficking of controlled substances, promoting of products or selling product to youth, serious crimes, links to organized crime, serious financial crimes. Like those are the types of things that we're looking for. I can't think of circumstances where, you know, people having an active presence on social media, even if it is related to cannabis industry, being something, it might be something that comes back as, that would come back to us as information from the RCMP. So when I talk about kind of those buckets of, you know, what's the path a request takes, it might be something that comes back with what we would call a hit from the RCMP that would cause us to have some concern. And usually what we would maybe do is go back with an intent to refuse, and then that individual has an opportunity to provide kind of their representation, so their characterization of the information that we've provided. And we within that, we have to identify our basis for considering refusing your application. So we have to tell you the information we're using to make that decision.
You could swap that person out if he was denied, or the whole application?
No, it is not always fatal to an application, and in fact, in most cases, it would probably not be fatal to an application. What we would be looking for, so it comes back to that concept of control. Who has control within the company, and if you have control, you have to hold a security clearance. So if you have someone within the process that doesn't make it through and their security clearance is refused, you can remove that individual. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to remove them entirely from your company, but we will be looking to understand how is it that that person is still operating within the company, but not in a position of control. So the example that I give for, you know, if your QAP goes through the process and their security clearance is refused, so it's your quality assurance person. If we have inspectors, for example, and go on site and we start talking to the staff and say, who's the quality assurance person, and the staff all point to the person whose security clearance was refused, but the person you have on record with us is another name, then we're really going to have a concern. So that's, we want to make sure that that is not the case. You can keep them in the company, You just have to make sure that they are removed from decision-making and they are truly not in a position of control.
What's defined as control? Like, say I raise $3 million, I'm looking for a grower, I hire the grower, I give him 10% equity, it turns out he is denied because he did something I didn't even know about.
Yeah.
What happens then?
So we have within our guidance documents, we talk about the concept of control. There are different things that will trigger that. Basically what we're looking for is who has the opportunity to influence your operations in a significant way in terms of decisions you make around, purchasing of product, distribution of product, sales of product, who makes decisions on strains that you use and what inventory you have. All of those things where somebody is in a position where they're making significant decisions around your operations, we would consider that to be a position of control. Okay.
Just to finish that off, if that security license is in limbo, sorry. Okay, so when it actually, so say I'm actually actively working on a different situation, not where I live, or somewhere else, does that stay there still? Or like, do I have to redo it? Or does it just sit there in limbo until I have an application to attach it to?
No, so what we will be doing, we've had a number of them that have come in, so we would actually go back to the applicant and communicate to them that their security clearance is not being processed. It would be inactivated and you would have to resubmit that security clearance.
Does this work? Yes. Hey, you said there's like 20 people that have micro licenses now that have been issued?
I'm just getting the numbers for you guys right now. I'm not trying to be weird. I'm actually texting with our office in Ottawa, trying to get you guys accurate numbers of what they are. So I'll just read the text message and get to you.
She's reading it right now?
Yes, she did. So, is there a question around that though?
Well, my question around that is, my understanding is that there's not very many. There's like under 100, maybe 50 people that are required. And so there's several 100,000 underground growers in Canada, so why do you think they're not all applying?
We have over 200 people who have applied for a micro application.
200?
And we have, when you include both micros and nurseries, we have 24 that are licensed at the moment.
24 licenses.
What is your goal?
Sorry, I'm going to let this individual finish this question.
Well, we're working on the same thing here.
Okay.
And the reality is that I've talked to growers all across BC and as far east as Halifax. And there's real concern that it's the program that's a great idea, but it's not working for them. And they're not applying. And there's some very good reasons for that. So do you have any idea why they're not applying? I mean, I thought you would have been flooded.
Yeah, and so, I'll be quite honest with you. We had early estimates as to how many micro applications that we had, that we were estimating. And we haven't seen as many applications as we had initially anticipated with that. In terms of delays of those coming through the system, so there's kind of two parts of that. So one, it's not entirely surprising to me that it has, like a year in, 25, as I say, we're now kind of licensing those on a regular basis, like pretty much every week. We are seeing new sites coming on board that is a combination of either standards and micros. So I actually feel like we are starting to kind of see a flow of those come through the system. It's not quite as high as that we would have expected, and so we are trying to better understand that. We're actually doing some work right now with our colleagues, and we'll be doing a little bit of outreach over the month of kind of February with some different groups to try to better understand why it is that people who might be interested in filing an application are not filing an application, and what component of that is that related to the federal licensing process? Is it related to people having difficulty getting financing, getting land, municipal requirements? Not all of those things necessarily fall within our control and won't necessarily be things that we can resolve. But as a federal government, we do have different levers, and we will reach out to different jurisdictions with information that we would receive. So I don't know specifically. I think there's probably different things we could speculate as to why people haven't come in, and I'm sure there's sort of a bucket of different reasons. But it is something we're understanding. Our goal is, at the end of the day, to have a diverse market with a huge range of both standard and micro producers.
I think what you guys, don't get me wrong on this, but I think what you guys are doing is good now, because previously when I was working with Health Canada and I asked for information, it would basically go in a black hole, and I wouldn't hear literally for years, and nobody looking at your file, it was a nightmare. And when extremely, and since the new government's come in, it's changed, and it's getting better. In short terms, I can maybe just say quickly, right now, there's a lot of growers out there, and the black market has been going on for 50 years, and it's been cops and robbers, and the robbers are winning. Okay, the war on drugs has been a failure. Okay, so now you have a bunch of people that have a real trust problem, I think, with the whole process. That's one issue. I think another issue is it's very complicated for people and very expensive. And I think there's no financing available. Most of these, if you want to put a micro together for one unit, it's probably looking at least, and I think we talked about this before, it's about at least $1 million. And none of these people have that kind of money in their back pocket. So there's a real financing problem. You can't go to the bank and get money. There's no government funding available right now. Ministry of Agriculture, who should be involved in this, seems to be, missing in action. So that's one. So we got, and the last part is incentive. Why would people want to stop what they're doing when they're making money and they've been doing it for years, and now they have to go through this whole process and probably shut down their existing operation and lose their income? In the States, what they've done is they've given people 2-year permits to transition over. So I think there's ways to solve these problems, but it requires, it's not going to work from the top down, okay? These growers don't need you, okay? You need them.
Yep. So that's really helpful for me. I appreciate it. Certainly appreciate the input. And it's feedback that we're always, welcome to hearing. So if you feel that there is a specific, part of us going out and talking to people is kind of twofold for us. We do hope that it's educational. So we hope that we are kind of getting information out to people that really reflects the licensing process as it operates. This is what we need. This is how we make decisions. This is what the likely outcomes for you are in terms of success of your application. So it is around kind of education, and anybody that sort of maybe wants to get in but doesn't know how, we're hoping that this will provide the information that they need to be able to do that. It's also an opportunity for us to learn. So it's a way for us to figure out what is it specifically that you feel is a barrier or a lack of incentive to coming into the market. We're very happy to receive what you feel is both specific feedback to that, specific things or ideas that you think would be solutions to that. So, we've provided our contact information, happy to receive that feedback in. We're all at a certain pay grade within the government, so we are representative of the government. Doesn't mean that we make all the decisions, but that's information that we take back and we work within our organization to try to address some of the problems. So,
Just quickly, I'm on the list of
Part of the security application includes spouses and education and employers. Does the RCMP or Health Canada contact any of them and interview any of current or past spouses or employers or business partners?
So program, at the moment, typically we are not doing interviews with individuals. We may try to use some open source information to kind of cross-reference information that has been provided to us. It's also part of the information that we would share with the RCMP when they do their record check, so they will look within their systems. The issue of spouse, so thank you for raising that. We do look at relationships, so affiliations, relationships, whether legally binding relationships or not. That is a part of our security process, and it is often a reason where we will have information applied within the security clearance process. Again, it doesn't necessarily all lead to a security clearance being refused. But if your spouse is associated with organized crime, that is something that we would come back with the information typically that we would receive from the RCMP. If it forms the basis of part of our decision, it would be included within that decision. We would not identify the individual's name. It would be as a relationship to subject A or a relationship to subject B. And in most of those cases, we have very specific examples that demonstrate that relationship and why there is concern. So it could be relationship, somebody's been pulled over and they're in a car with subject B and they've got 20 kilos of cocaine in the car. And so that would be something that we would be looking at. What's your relationship with that individual? Even if you say, well, it wasn't mine, it was his, you're in a relationship with that individual, and that would create a concern for us within the framework. Again, those are fairly unusual, but those are things that we will look at.
But they're not actively going out and interviewing any of the parties on your employment list, for example?
Correct.
Okay. Related to for what the RCMP does, other areas like education, if you're a teacher or a volunteer and you're working with kids, you're doing a criminal record check through the RCMP. Is it a similar process? Or is it more comprehensive or different?
So typically, both the scope and the types of things that they're looking for within that. So it depends a little bit. There's all kinds of circumstances where people have criminal background record checks. So usually those are limited to just instances of criminal activity or instances of criminal activity linked to the type of work that you would be doing. So anybody who has a history of criminal activity, for example, if you're working with children, those would be the types of things that they would be concerned about. Our scope on it is much broader than that. So that's part of there is the criminal background record check where we are really just looking to what have been kind of convictions on record. But when we do the law enforcement record check with the RCMP, we're really looking for any instances of interaction with law enforcement.
Because those ones happen pretty quickly.
Yes. We're pretty quick too, actually, but we do have, just in terms of kind of processing of them, so I think we're down now to kind of a few hundred that have not been processed of security clearance applications in queue. In terms of them being processed and sent to the RCMP and waiting for response back. The majority of them, I would say probably about 75% of applications, we receive the response back from the RCMP within a matter of weeks. Things that do create complexity, as I say, could include employment history, if it includes multiple jurisdictions, residency that includes multiple jurisdictions, criminal background, all of those things can cause the process to be delayed. But generally the return on those is fairly quick, kind of across the board. The only thing I will say is that we don't actually issue the security clearance until we issue the license. And everybody who is required to hold a license with the application has to have made it through that process before we would consider licensing.
Just to let everybody know, I do have a few people in line, so I'm not forgetting about anybody. I'm just going in the order that people are putting their hands up.
Hi, so just keeping with that same thread, it seems to me that you don't have a hard-line rule in terms of whether a person going through the criminal checks is rehabilitated or not. So like Pardons Canada or waivers suggest that, if a person has a criminal record, after 7 to 10 years, they're considered rehabilitated. So what would you say to someone who's trying to apply with a record that was, consistent 7 years ago, but they have no instances of criminality now?
Yeah, that's a fair point. The security world, so I don't come from necessarily a security background. I work with a team of experts in my group. And it's one of the things, we often have kind of conversations back and forth as I'm trying to understand. Security in lots of ways is kind of very black and white, but it's not often very black and white in terms of being able to say to someone, this definitively would be a yes, and this would definitively would be a no. It really is very case-by-case specific. We look at a lot of different things. So we look at the nature of the activity. We look at kind of proximity. So when we talk about relationships, Is this your spouse, or is it kind of your third cousin that you haven't interacted with in 10 years? The age at which the activity was conducted. Most of us were idiots when we were 17 years old, so we look at those types of things. Was this something you did when you were 17 and carefree? Or is it something that you did when you were 40 years old and should have known better? We look at scale. So is this, if we're talking about previous history with cannabis or other controlled substances, were these instances of minor possession or even maybe minor sale? Or was this somebody having a huge scale operation where you were seeing a lot of transactions in terms of sales, in terms of interactions of individuals that they were interacting with? So there's all kinds of things that can kind of expand it and contract it. As I say, we don't like surprises, so generally what can go a long way with people is transparency around that information.
Okay, and so if you were to deny or request more information, they would have an opportunity to present their case. And then if you were to deny based on that additional information, would you then present the reasons why you made that denial? And could we then use that as a hardline rule?
I'm not sure I understood kind of the last part of that question.
Okay, so they're going to have an opportunity to present. So if there's an initial denial, they're going to have an opportunity to present their case. I was 17 years old, yada yada yada. And after that, if there's another denial, like a solid denial after that, would that be based on sort of hardline rules that you've now created?
So depends on how you're looking to apply it. So there are factors that the decision maker ultimately is considered the minister, and we act on their behalf. So when we make a decision, there are certain factors that are set out in the regulations to establish situations where we can refuse a security clearance. Those are sort of broad categories of information that we can consider to make a decision on a security clearance application. When we receive information that would lead to a refusal, we would communicate an intent to refuse. You would have an opportunity to respond to that. If we don't feel that you have addressed the issues that were identified in the intent to refuse, that could lead to a security clearance refusal. In terms of whether or not that then is considered a hard rule that could be applied to 2 other people down the road, in theory, yes. The challenge is that they rarely are sort of one fact that leads to a decision of a refusal. It is usually sort of a combination of factors that we're trying to assess to determine what is the history of this individual and what issue does it create for the framework. So it's kind of a matrix more than a sort of checklist of this or that. Okay.
Hi, I'm really interested in the 2-batch amendment and what's involved in that. Exactly. I've just heard rumors of it, and it's...
I've heard rumors of it as well. No, okay, so what you're referring to is when someone wants to add one of the new cannabis classes to their licenses. So you're a processor, license holder, you'd like to add dried, fresh, extracts, edibles, topical, a lot of cookies. Their immediate goal for their immediate future is I'm always going to produce 700 cookies in one batch, and that's going to be my lot. I would ask that you produce 2 of those lots, so 1,400 cookies, for us to understand that you were able to do it once, and you're able to do it twice, and you were consistent in your production practices. Does that help you? So it really does depend on scale. A lot of people get really hooked on the representative lot because it depends on like sampling wise, it means different. But for us, it's representative of your activity. So what we don't want to have, and to be honest, it's not a good use of our resources. We've had people package a bottle and say, okay, there's my bottle, and there's my other bottle. Those are the lots. That's not helpful. That doesn't really give a good indication to us whether or not you're doing what you're doing when it comes to production practices. So it doesn't have to be where you're going 2 years from now. It doesn't have to match that size, but your immediate scale production is what we're looking for, so that we could say that, based on your ability to produce 2 similar lots that are representative of your hopefully near production, will give us a good indication that, we don't have as much concern regarding your activities.
Hi there.
several times before, not the Revenue Canada. We invited you out to the Kootenays in April of last year. And just as an additional comment to what you were saying about not having feedback, we actually prepared a handout for you, and you guys left before we could actually, like, we actually wanted you to come out and hear what we had to say. We got more than 200 growers together in our area in the Kootenays to come out. We invited these people to come, and we presented you after with a paper. You guys had already left, we forwarded it on to you. So you have had feedback from growers, substantial feedback from growers on what we need. And after attending all of these sessions and all of the conferences and everything else that I've attended over the past few years, I've come to the firm conclusion that what you were trying to do is put a factory system on a craft process, and it does not apply. Most of us cannot meet the criteria that you are setting up. And in fact, it does not pay us to do so, if you just bear with me. Craft is there because it's a small niche market. We are trying to be nimble on our feet. We have to change production practices quickly if we want to capture a cookie market at a fair or whatever. It's a very, very small market, okay? And you're trying to say we need these major production practices, and they just really don't apply. They don't apply for anything at a farmer's market, okay? It's just inappropriate. It's the wrong system. You need to start again with the micros and do something that is much more suitable for craft production. And I think the best way to do that is to actually consult with craft growers. And you have not done that yet, in spite of the fact that you came out and talked to us, but you have not listened to us. And what we're going to do now in BC is we are setting up a craft advisory council, and we hope to meet with you and to give you clear direction on the changes that you have to meet in order to let us get in the system, because there's a whole lot of very, very frustrated growers who have been in the system. They're the best growers out here, and quite frankly, you have not proved with your commercial system and your factory system that you can deliver quality pot. The pot that's out there is crappy. Everybody thinks so. Everyone thinks so, okay? So our pot is the real pot. Don't call our pot unsafe. It's not unsafe. Your pot is unsafe, okay? You guys with the quality control officers and all that stuff, you guys are having a problem. We never did, okay? So I just like that recognized, and you really have to come to us for advice on how to do this properly, because you are not, okay? And that's what I have to say.
So thank you for that. Thanks for that. I hear the passion. We have met previously, so we've met at a number of different sessions, and you and I have certainly had conversations. So it would be disappointing to me if you felt like we left these sessions and we were not listening to you, and that or if you felt that we are not really interested in trying to have those conversations and to hear what you really feel are solutions to kind of get to a different place. As I say, we are representatives of the government. That doesn't mean that I can go back and kind of reinvent the cannabis framework. We work within a large organization, but we do our best to kind of hear what people say to us, to take it back, and to try to put that into ideas, whether it's the idea that you bring forward or whether it's something else. So we do. Certainly if you're setting up an advisory council and you want to have someone come and listen to that, we're more than happy to do it. Jackie's team, Jackie's actually on the ground in BC. We're building up a little bit of a team around her. And we have tried to say to people, if you want somebody to come to present information, if you want someone to come and to hear what you're seeing on the ground, and I think CRA is kind of saying the same thing, we're more than happy to do that. So you have our contact information, and feel free to provide our contact information. We're more than happy to come out and listen. Okay? Okay, it is, and that's a concern to me too. Okay, that's a concern to me too. So maybe at the end, I'll take your contact information and we can connect. Okay?
Hi, I work for BC Cross FICO. One of our one of our cultivators holds a micro processing license and has applied the amendment for the federal sales license and done the 2 batches, everything. We're wondering what time frame we can see for that to be issued and if there's a service standard for that process.
So I'll talk a little bit about that. Service standards, we're actually hoping to come forward later this year with service standards around the initial licensing, that kind of tip to tail, as well as some of the key categories for amendments. So a couple of the areas where people probably have most interest is around expansion. So that diagram we had presented earlier where you license a portion of your facility and you expand out from that. is one area where we see a lot of amendments. And then the other is the sales authorities. At the moment, in terms of processing of those applications, so we have about 280 license holders. And so, those are all at various times submitting different amendments for their business. Generally, those applications are screened within, I would say, 5 to 10 business days. They're usually picked up, I would say, within 4 to 6 weeks from a complete application. So after screening, once it's complete, they're usually picked up within about 4 to 6 weeks. The sales amendment, the consideration for that application includes 2 components. So there's the initial review that my team does, which is the paper-based application. And then we work with our colleagues that work in the regions who actually deploy an inspector. They go out and are on site. The data that we have right now for that entire process to run its course, it's probably about 6 months from time of complete application, us to pick it up, review it, be referred for an inspection to have occurred, and the reporting process to have happened. The big variability on that is the back end of the process. So in most inspections, when they come out of the inspection, they will rate each observation. So you could have a major observation, a critical observation. Those will go to you as an inspection report. And then you have an opportunity, what we're looking for is a corrective action plan for those. So that process will take quite a bit of kind of back and forth. So I don't actually have data in terms of what portion of that is with us versus what's with you guys.
If it's just dried flower, does that speed up the process at all?
It's probably the more straightforward in terms of the product categories, but a lot of the time is actually around those sort of how long it takes somebody to pick something up for review, how long it takes for the inspection to occur. So I wouldn't say it probably happens a lot faster than that. We did see probably a faster rate leading up to the new classes of the new regulations coming out for the new classes, just because we were working with some time frames there that if somebody didn't have a decision by a certain date, then a whole new set of requirements applied to them after they'd applied. So I would say we managed it a little bit differently there, but generally it's about that.
And I'd like to add that when you're going through your amendment application, the better set up you are to have the inspection come in. Because the challenge we actually have is a lot of times we go to the company and we say, okay, so you're ready? And they're like, no. We're not actually ready. So before you put that application in, make sure you have everything in place, those lots in hand, everything ready to go, so that when we're ready to hit go, hey, I'm an inspector, I'd like to come to your site at this particular point, you don't send us away, because that's actually been a challenge for us.
Hi, I'm Logan Dunn from Cannabis, and I have a question with regards to multiple licenses. If you are a micro cultivator currently and you're looking to have additional licenses, I think your number is 10 total, if I remember correctly. Is it easier to get an additional license at a different location because you guys already have the SOPs and all the information required for the company and how we operate? Or is it a brand new application where you require all that information that is the same?
So I'll give you the typical bureaucratic response, which is it depends. So we don't have a cap on licenses per se. So you can have multiple licenses at an individual site. That's that kind of vertical integration. So if you have a site, so the site is basically the address that you have that is completely within your control. You can have that combination of licenses that we've gone through kind of in the table. So you can have a cultivation, processing, and medical sales license, you can have a research license. So depending on what combinations you want, you can have multiple licenses. We only have so many types of licenses, so at an individual site, you will only be able to have certain combinations and numbers of licenses just because we don't have any other licenses to give you. As an individual, can you have multiple? We don't have a cap per se. If you want to have 10 sites, for example, we don't have a cap that says you can have 10, but you can't have 11. In theory, as an owner, you could have multiple sites. Each one has to operate as a standalone business, so it has to operate as a standalone address. And you have to meet the requirements for that. So it's a new application. It's still subject to the same cost recovery fees, and you have to meet all of the application requirements. In terms of whether it's easy, it's easier. The process itself doesn't change, but generally once somebody has been licensed once, they're familiar with the process, they're familiar with how to demonstrate requirements. So generally, we find that the quality of those applications is higher. And so anytime we're working with a quality application, the review is just generally easier to do. Okay?
I'll just add something for the CRA. So it's actually a lot simpler for us. So basically, as long as the separate site is underneath the same corporate entity, the same corporation, you do not need a new license. You just need to let us know that we'll be operating on the site, and you can choose whether or not you want to file separately for each site or you want to consolidate and return. But as long as the sites are within the same legal entity, you do not need a separate license.
Thank you.
Do we have a question So, we'll probably just.
Sorry, I was just going to say, maybe we have 3 more questions in line, and we only have about 10 minutes left, so I think we'll leave it to those 3 questions that are in line. But Jackie, Joanne, and Darren will be up here if you do want to accost them afterwards.
As about when we acquire our initial startup material from the black market, is there any limitation, and what specific reporting requirements do we have?
Okay, so you want to go or you?
No, go ahead and I'll.
Okay, so anyone that's looking to bring, so you guys most likely have cannabis in your possession already. That's fine. And you probably work really hard to get your genetics, right? And you want to bring your genetics with you. So in the regulation, there's a section 10.1 and subsection 10.1 and 10.2. So 10.1 says basically the only way you can have cannabis in your possession is if you obtained it legally. 10.2 says, except in the case that you haven't obtained a license yet, you can submit a declaration to us where you identify how many plants and seeds you're bringing in with you at that particular point. It's a one-time thing. So you can't amend this at any point, and you have to submit this declaration in advance of actually receiving your license. And what I want to highlight about this is the intent behind it for us was that it was meant to be an ability to bring your genetics in. It wasn't meant for you to bring your entire flower and crop with you in. It's more seeds and plants so that when you've done all that work on your amazing genetics, that you get to bring it with you, but you're not bringing necessarily your entire production.
It's a one-time shot, so you bring in as like diversity of strains, you bring in unlimited amounts.
We're not necessarily prescriptive about it, but when you get to a kind of higher number, we'd like to understand why you need that number. So we may go back and forth with you a little bit on that. But beyond that, I'm not aware of like a cap. But we would be looking for you to clarify why that number that you're looking to bring in with you.
What about the source? Do you have to really clarify the source?
I don't want to know. I would like the declaration. What I want to know is that we love honesty. That's who doesn't love honesty, right? As long as you're honest with what you're bringing in with you, so be accurate. And to be clear, you're going to have this record, and someone at some point is going to say, hey, I'm here for an inspection. Can I see that record, and can I verify that that's actually what you brought in with you? So be honest about it, and you can bring that in with you. I don't want to know where you got it from. As long as you were in possession of it on the day that you had your license, and it was in line with what you submitted in the declaration, I don't need to know any more.
And if you want that in writing, question 10 in the sheet that we handed out kind of goes through that in a little bit more detail, so you can refer to that.
So in terms of the CRA, the legislation actually does not allow you to possess any cannabis prior to receiving certificates. However, we do recognize that Health Canada does have this 10.2 declaration, so administratively we've taken the position that if you make a declaration to Health Canada, we will accept that. When you're doing the licensing process with us, you'll be asked, do you have a declaration to be made? We will verify that with Health Canada, and then the day we issue your CRA license, we're going to come out and do that inventory count. If it's in excess of your declaration, there is potential of penalties and seizure of material, but if it's within your declaration, it's all good. So as long as you maintain your quantities to that declaration and it's accurate, it's okay with the CRA.
And to be clear, if like plants die, right? So you make your declaration and plants die, make a record of that. So you can come in with less, but you can't come in with more.
This is one area where,
when we go out and talk to people, we talk a lot about record keeping and the importance of record keeping for a regulator. There's really very few things that are more important than your records and the quality of those records. Your declaration of your starting materials is one example where it's important to have really clear records on it. So we don't ask a lot of questions on it. It was intentionally sort of set up that way for people who might be coming from an industry prior to being licensed. But all of your records from there on should support that. So if that was your starting inventory for starting materials, everything kind of going forward from there should align with that.
Well, one thing else to mention about that is that the expectation of the products that we produce from those initial like clones and seeds, they meet all the regulatory requirements for good production practices. So that's one of the reasons that we're really trying to aim towards the plants and seeds and not your flower plants that you're bringing.
This one's for the CRA. I know it's a little bit of a loaded question, and I know it takes a lot of stakeholder consultation with the provinces, but has there been any consideration to one national excise stamp?
Yeah. So that's a little bit more of a tricky one. To give you the short answer, it's probably not in the cards for the future. It would require a change to the legislation, but it's more than just changing the legislation. When the government entered into a coordinated tax collection with the provinces, so the federal government basically collects the tax and gives it back to the provinces. They get 3/4 of the revenue. Part of the agreements with each province was that they would have their own stamp because they wanted to have the same thing as tobacco. So it's a lot more involved than just changing the Excise Act 2001. It involves negotiations with the provinces. And I don't think that the provinces are at this point willing to give up their own excise stamps. So, but what we have said to the industry is that we recognize that the actual design of the stamp, it was meant for cigarette packages. We had a limited amount of time, so we just took what we had for cigarettes. So we've said to the industry, like, we're not married to that design of the stamp. If the industry wants a different size of stamp, a different format of the stamp, it's something that we can consider. But we want the industry to come to us with sort of requirements and specifications. And we will definitely, we can definitely consider that.
Thank you.
I heard a vicious rumor that Health Canada irradiates the pot they have, and the rumor even goes to the point that all of the pot has to be irradiated. Now, when you irradiate pot, it does completely make it sterile for the first minute, and then it goes back to where it was. But it's not the same anymore. The seeds in the apple won't grow, things like that. It puts a whole new definition to getting a blow on, actually. But since people have been growing pot either side of 10,000 years, and it's only been irradiated for the last year or two, were they doing it wrong, or have you got it confused?
So, Health Canada doesn't have any marijuana.
No, but is it a regulation? Is it regulated by the provinces?
No, I'm just joking, I'm sorry. So, no, we do not require anyone to irradiate any of their products. It's at the discretion of the company. So we have established that the company has to go and decide what specifications they're going to adhere to when it comes to their products for heavy metals, like microbials, other things like that. They make that decision based on existing compendials. So these are documents that are used by the pharmaceutical industry that gives kind of specifications on what's the right amount of bio-negative or bio-gram-negative bacteria or whatever it is. So you establish that in advance what your specifications are. You grow whatever you grow, and then you test that product. In some cases, some companies have decided, in every case, no matter what I grow, I want to irradiate my product for whatever reason. That was their business decision. In other cases, some companies aren't that good at growing, and they end up having a dirtier product. They can't meet their own specifications. So then they choose to irradiate it. But there is in no way a requirement by Health Canada to irradiate your product. You just have to meet the specifications for which you established yourself in testing.
Can you put a little skull and crossbones on the package so they know which ones to go with and which one?
And it's not a requirement, and that's a good point. We can take that back as a consideration for future labeling requirements for certain, but there is no requirement. There are companies that are transparent about it, and there are other companies that are, it's really, and some people market it that they're not actually doing that. So it's really, again, a business decision of the company.
Well, if the rumor were true, and you were making it mandatory, it would have been the biggest boom to the black stock market we've ever made, because a lot of people, for health reasons, and basically 80% of the people that smoke pot are doing it because they have some de-stressing, de-painting, whatever, or they're hanging in a circle with some friends, and that's what's happening. But it really affects people who are sensitive. And the pot, I don't know any way they can test and say this or that. It does sort of like fall like dust out of the package, so that might be some indication. Speaking of the package, CBC, National Film Board used to shoot on a ratio of 9 to 1. So 9 feet, one would get used. Now, you guys are about, is it 10 or 20 grams per gram in the packaging that you have to have? And is the packaging recyclable, or it could be recyclable? I don't think it should be recycled. I think it should be compostable with a little compartment for the seed, and that stuff's going to go in everybody's backyard, not on the street. But that's the suggestion I bring you. But
No, and that's actually, we hear a lot of, actually, and it's something that I think it's one of those things that the industry is still relatively new. And so the packaging industry hasn't necessarily been able to catch up with what kind of our requirements are. So we don't require that it's indestructible. We require that it meets child-resistant packaging requirements. And so the industry that does the packaging has to establish what that is and what those materials are and how it meets those tests. So I take your point, and it's something we've heard a lot, and we'll take it back with this again. But I just really wanted to highlight that it's not necessarily that we require it, it's that we require child-resistant packaging. And so those tests have to be established, that they demonstrate that they can have that type of packaging that meets that specification.
well, then make it so that the kids have to eat it to get to the package, and it tastes like broccoli.
That's unfortunate all the time we have questions.
Can I just make an announcement?
Okay.
That'd be possible. I just want to, anybody who's in the craft micro area application process or has a license, there is a co-op being formed in BC. It has been formed. It's in the process of getting it going. There will be an information session tomorrow from 12:30 to 2:30. If anyone is interested, I'll be outside with the information if anyone wants to talk.
There's information on the tables outside.
Yeah, it's also on the tables.
Yeah.
This is the. Oh,
Do we have to register?
no, I don't think so.
And I'm just going to pass it back to Joanne to close this out.
I'll be very quick.
I just want to say thanks to everybody. Hopefully this was helpful to you. We have another session this afternoon. You had to register for it. We have a booth set up over the next couple of days, so we'll have staff at the booth. Feel free to pop in and ask them questions. They're equally approachable as us. You have our contact information. Send us questions, send us comments. We're happy to receive it. So thank you.